I'm 84, and last Tuesday morning, I sat down at this kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. Dorothy had passed 3 days before that, 79 years old. She'd been sitting right across from me in that chair not 6 weeks ago, eating cornbread from Eleanor's old recipe, asking me whether the chamomile had come up in the back garden yet. I've been thinking every morning since about 5 things I watch Dorothy do every single day. 5 habits that seemed ordinary, harmless, sensible even, by the way most people think about these things. I've written some of what I know about all of this. It's in my book, links right there in the description if you want it. But what I want to tell you today is about Dorothy, and about 5 habits I believe cost her more time than she had left to spend. If any of what I say sounds familiar, like someone you're having breakfast with right now, or like yourself, I hope you'll say so down in the comments. And if you'd like to stay, I'd be glad of the company. Hit subscribe. I'll be back here next week. Dorothy was a careful woman. That's the part that stays with me. She wasn't reckless, wasn't foolish, wasn't the kind of person who ignored things that needed tending. She kept her appointments, took her vitamins, called her daughter every Sunday morning at noon without fail. By every measure I can put a name to, Dorothy was doing things right. But there are 5 things I watched her do, day in and day out, that I understand differently now than I did when she was alive. The first one is the one I see most often in people our age, and it looks, from the outside, like the most harmless thing in the world. She sat down. I don't mean it the way it sounds. I mean she stopped moving, not all at once, but over 2 or 3 years, the way a creek carves a channel without anyone standing there to watch it happen. She and I used to walk around the block on evenings when the weather was decent. Maybe a quarter mile, maybe half. Nothing ambitious. Then her knee started bothering her, and she said she needed to rest it. That made sense. It made sense for a week, maybe 2. But the resting never stopped. By last winter, Dorothy was sitting in her armchair from after breakfast until her daughter called in the afternoon. 8, 9 hours some days. Her doctor had told her to take it easy. She was doing exactly what she'd been told to do. Eleanor used to say, and she said it plainly, the way nurses say things they've watched prove themselves too many times. She said the worst thing you can do to a body that's slowing down is tell it to stop. 28 years of nursing, and she said she saw more patients decline from rest than from work. She was talking about people exactly Dorothy's age, in exactly Dorothy's situation. I should have told Dorothy that. I didn't. The second thing was water. Dorothy had traded it off, quietly, over years. Instant coffee in the morning, sweet tea in the afternoon, a glass of juice before bed. She told me water upset her stomach if she had too much of it. I nodded and said nothing. Eleanor's nursing journal is still right here on this shelf where she kept it, and it has 3 full pages on what slow, quiet dehydration does to joints, to kidneys, and to thinking in a person over 70. 3 pages in Eleanor's careful handwriting, because she watched it happen over and over, and she wanted to understand why. People who didn't feel thirsty didn't drink and couldn't understand why they felt foggy and stiff and far away from themselves. The third thing was about food. Dorothy lived alone, same as I do. Somewhere along the way she'd started skipping meals, not because she wasn't hungry, because cooking for one felt like too much trouble for what it was worth. Crackers, a piece of cheese, something from a package that didn't ask anything of her. I asked about it once, and she said her appetite wasn't what it used to be. I nodded at that too. What I didn't say was that appetite goes when you stop feeding it real food. The body gets accustomed to less, starts asking for less, and then runs on less. That is not a direction you want to be traveling at 79. The fourth thing was the pills. Dorothy was on 7 medications when she passed. 7. I'm not standing here to tell you to stop your medications. I don't know your situation. I'm not your doctor, and I'm careful about that line. But I'll say this. 7 is a number worth asking questions about. I had 5 prescriptions after my heart attack in 2009. I asked questions. I read everything I could put my hands on. I talked it through with Eleanor, who had decades of perspective on what those things do inside a person. And I made changes, slowly, carefully, with my doctor involved throughout. And those prescriptions came off my list, one at a time. That was my decision and my situation. What I know about Dorothy is that she never asked a single question about what 7 different medications were doing together inside her. Not one. And the 5th thing is the one it took me the longest to name clearly. Dorothy stopped going outside. She had her reasons. Good ones, she thought. The front steps were slippery in winter, and she was afraid of falling. She had her programs and her crossword puzzles, and she was comfortable indoors. The world outside had started to feel like it belonged to younger people. I understood every one of those reasons. After Eleanor passed, I had 3 months where I sat on the edge of the bed every morning, trying to find a reason to stand up. But I kept going to the garden. I kept going to the workshop because my father's voice was still somewhere in the back of my head, clear as it ever was, telling me a man who stops moving stops living. Dorothy stopped going outside 2 years before she passed. And last Tuesday, I sat here with my coffee and her chair was empty. Now here's what I want you to understand. I noticed every one of those 5 things. I watched each one take hold. I was at Dorothy's house often enough, had her over often enough, that I saw each habit form, the way you see a crack appear in an old wall. You notice it, you tell yourself it'll hold, and then one day you walk past and the wall has come down. The part that weighs on me is that I never said a word, not because I didn't care about her, because there's an agreement between people our age not to say the hard thing. We don't tell each other we look tired. We don't ask why someone's hands are shaking at the kitchen table. We figure they know their own business. But knowing your own business assumes you have the right information. And I don't think Dorothy had it. My father's notebook goes back to sometime in the 30s. Brown cover, hand-bound, 200 pages in his careful handwriting. Remedies and observations and margin notes that he added over 50 years of watching how people in his community lived and what happened to them afterward. The pages are so worn at the corners now, they feel almost like skin when you handle them. I've been sitting with that book every evening since Dorothy passed, not looking for remedies, reading the observations he wrote in the margins, the kind of notes an engineer makes, which is to say without drama, just what he saw and what came after. He had something about every one of these 5 things, not in those words, not in any clinical language, but he'd written about a woman who stopped leaving her house after her husband passed and was gone inside 2 years. He wrote about a man who lived on salt crackers and tinned goods and how his thinking started failing before his body did. And in the margin of a page about yarrow tea, in pencil, one line I've had above the kitchen window for 6 years. The ones who stay still, die still. Eleanor would have known exactly what to say to Dorothy. She had the kind of directness that comes from watching too many people wait too long. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice because it's already standing on solid ground. She would have sat right here across this table and said something quiet and plain and impossible to argue with. I don't have Eleanor's way of saying the hard thing. I have my daddy's way, which is to sit with it too long and then write it down. I have spent a long time writing it down. The Coleman Remedy book has a full section on these 5 habits. The sitting still, the quiet dehydration, the skipped meals, the unquestioned medications, the slow withdrawal from the outside world, and what I do in place of each one, and why, and the specific things from my own garden and kitchen that I have used every day for 30 years. The measurements, the routines, what to pay attention to, what is worth asking your doctor about. The link is in the description. Not because I have all the answers. I don't, and I never set out to pretend otherwise. But because these things are worth writing down, somewhere they won't disappear. My granddaughter Clara was visiting the month before Dorothy passed. She's 14. She sat right across from me at this table, eating oatmeal, and said the way teenagers will say things without fully knowing the weight of them. She said, "Grandpa, why do old people always say they're fine?" I didn't have an answer for her right then. I've been thinking about it since. I think we say we're fine because we've spent our whole lives learning to take up less space, to ask for less, to need less. And there's a real difference between choosing simplicity and quietly disappearing. Dorothy was withdrawing, one small step at a time. And I called it her being a private woman, and I left her to it. I shouldn't have. 3 days after Dorothy's service, I went to the garden at 5:30 in the morning, the way I do every day. Rain, cold, it doesn't matter much to me anymore. Still dark enough that you could see the last stars over the Blue Ridge. I was pulling weeds along the chamomile row, working by feel, the way you do before the light comes up. Clara's question came back to me, not the question itself, the thing sitting underneath it. The fact that someone watching from the outside could see clearly what those of us standing right next to it couldn't. I stood there in the cold dirt and understood what I'd been circling all week, without finding the center of. There is no single morning when a person decides to step back from living. It happens in steps so small that by the time anyone can see the distance, it's already too far to call across. Each of Dorothy's 5 habits was one of those steps. Each one was ordinary. Each one made its own quiet sense, standing alone. And taken together, every single day, for 2 years running, they covered a great deal of ground in the wrong direction. I went back inside and opened my father's notebook. Opened it the way you open a book you've had a long time, wherever it falls. There was a page I either hadn't read in years or had never paid proper attention to. At the top, in Earl's handwriting, just 3 words with nothing after them. Alive, not only. I don't know exactly what he meant when he wrote it down. He didn't explain his headings, but I know what it means to me. It means the measure of how you're doing isn't whether you're still breathing, it's whether you're still in your life, still going to the garden before the light comes up, still cooking something that smells like it belongs in a real kitchen, still walking to the end of the block, still talking to the people who are left. I came inside and made the morning tonic, ginger and elderberry and yarrow, the same herbs in the same order my father used every morning, the same smell I have woken up to in some form since I was a boy sitting at Earl's table in Harlan County, Kentucky. I sat down here. Eleanor's chair was across from me the way it always is. I don't move that chair. Some mornings that's harder than others. That morning was one of the harder ones, but I sat with it. I didn't try to fix it or hurry through it or make it mean something it doesn't. I let it be what it is. The weight of 54 years beside a woman I loved, and the fact that she is gone, and the fact that I am still here. And there is something in that last part, the fact that I am still here, still making the tonic, still going to the garden in the dark, still sitting down at this table on Tuesday evenings to say something I believe is worth saying to whoever is willing to listen. I've written it all down, everything my father knew and kept in that brown notebook from the 1930s, passed to him from his Appalachian grandmother, who understood plants the way most people understand roads. Everything Eleanor taught me from 28 years of nursing and from 54 years of knowing me better than I knew myself. Everything I figured out on my own since the doctors were done with me after the heart attack in 2009. And I sat down with those 2 old notebooks and decided to start asking my own questions. I called it the Coleman Remedy Book. It is not a medical textbook. I am not a doctor, and I never pretended to be. It is not a plan for anyone else to follow exactly the way I followed it. It is a record. What worked for one stubborn man who had good teachers, paid close attention, and refused to go quiet before his time. The 5 habits I watched take years from Dorothy, and the 5 things I do in place of every one of them. They are all in there. Everything I still know. The link is down in the description. Read it the way you'd read a letter a neighbor left on your kitchen table before a long trip. Not looking for instructions, looking for company. That is all I ever wanted to leave behind. Not a warning, not a lecture, Dorothy deserved more company than she had at the end. Most of us do. And the 5 habits I watched her keep, each one quiet, each one ordinary, each one feeling like perfectly good sense at the time. They closed her off from the world a little at a time, until the world had trouble reaching her anymore. I'm 84. I've been around long enough to know that the most dangerous thing is rarely the one that hurts. It's the one that feels just fine. Keep moving, drink your water, cook something your grandmother would recognize. Ask questions about every pill that goes in your mouth. And go outside. Every day go outside, even if it's just to the end of the block and back. My daddy used to say, the most expensive cure is the one somebody sells you. Think on that.